The debrief officer had a face like a man who had already written his summary and was only listening to me as a courtesy. He had a mug of something hot, a recording slate, and the particular posture of someone who believes they understand a situation they were not present for. I didn't hold it against him. Most people who hadn't been in the Ashfeld corridor held their opinions with that kind of confidence. I'd been sitting in the same chair for 20 minutes before he turned the recorder on. That was fine. I'd been sitting on a rock in a canyon for 4 minutes and 17 seconds while 14 soldiers died around me. And I hadn't moved then either. Waiting is a skill. You learn it or you don't. State your name and role for the record, he said. Merritt Ulm, Agricultural Survey Technician, Contract Grade 4. I was embedded with the Karathi Patrol as local area guide under the Joint Corridor Access Agreement, subsection 9, Civilian Observer Provision. And you're the only survivor. I looked at him. Colonel Verith Keene survived, I said. He's in the medical bay. I understand his hands won't stop shaking. The officer made a note. The only civilian survivor. I was the only civilian present. The colonel brought 17 military personnel. One survived. That's not a rounding error. That's a result. He looked up from his slate. There was a sound from under the table. A low exhale. The kind of sound a sleeping animal makes when it shifts without waking. The officer glanced down, then back at me. He didn't ask about it. I appreciated that. It would have derailed the whole conversation, and I wanted to get through the debrief and eat a real meal and sleep somewhere that didn't smell like ferrous rock and dried blood. Walk me through from the beginning, he said. I did. The beginning, for the purposes of the record, was 14 days before the incident, when I was pulled from a soil composition survey in the West Plateau and told I'd been seconded to a Karathi military operation. Karathi Imperium had formal access rights to the Ashfeld corridor under the same treaty that nominally restricted their armed presence to the corridor's 2 outer lanes, the inner canyon system, what the locals called the throat, what the survey maps labeled the Ashfeld interior, had been a treaty exclusion zone for 11 years. Troll's stated purpose was to place a geodetic survey marker at coordinates inside the interior. The Colonial Affairs Office had objected. The diplomatic attaché had smiled in a particular way that I have since come to think of as the last expression several of those soldiers made. And the Colonial Affairs Office had been overruled by someone 2 levels up who wanted the relationship maintained. I was assigned as guide because I'd done 11 survey seasons in the Ashfeld. I knew the terrain. More relevantly, I knew what lived there. My immediate supervisor, a practical woman named Doss, who had survived 4 contract renewals by being right about things before she was asked, me aside before I boarded the transport. You've been in the interior, she said. It wasn't a question. Twice. Short penetrations both times. Survey work, in and out in 72 hours. And I was very quiet, I said, and I didn't bring any weapons. And I left when I found the first territorial marker. Doss looked at me with the expression she reserved for situations where she had said everything useful that could be said, and was now simply acknowledging that the universe was going to do what it was going to do. Submit your site reports before you leave, she said. All of them. I did. Then I packed my field kit, made sure my rations had more than I needed, and boarded the transport. Colonel Verith Keene was not what I expected, which is to say he was exactly what I expected, which is the kind of thing you only realize in retrospect. He was tall for a Karathi. They averaged about 2 meters, and he was a centimeter or 2 over that. With the close-set amber eyes and the layered gray-green scale along his shoulders and jaw that marked the officer class, he wore his rank insignia on both shoulders, a redundancy I had never understood. He introduced himself, told me my role was logistical and advisory, and made it clear in the particular diplomatic way that very senior military personnel make things clear, that he considered local guides to be a bureaucratic requirement rather than a professional resource. I told him I'd done 11 survey seasons in the Ashfeld, and that I had 2 observations for him before we entered the corridor. He said, noted, in a way that meant not noted. I told him anyway. First, the Ashfeld interior had a resident apex predator population that had not been formally cataloged but had been consistently present across every documented survey incursion. Second, Those populations had demonstrated no aggressive behavior towards civilian survey teams operating without weapons in off-lane areas. There was no documented history of military incursion into the interior, so the behavioral response to an armed patrol was genuinely unknown. The colonel looked at me with the amber eyes and said that the patrol was rated for containment of any threat class encountered in the corridor. I said that was reassuring. His navigation officer, a younger Karathi, female, the kind of competence that shows in how someone handles their equipment rather than in how they talk about it, caught my eye for a fraction of a second after the colonel turned away. She didn't say anything, neither did I, but I noticed it, and I suspect she noticed that I noticed, and that was the entirety of the exchange. Her name was Sarath. She was 26 years old. I found out her name in the colonel's incident report. I did not say what I was actually thinking at the colonel, which was that a threat class rating is a bureaucratic category assigned by people who have never met the thing being rated, and that the category doesn't change the thing. I had seen territorial markers in the interior on both my previous surveys. The claw impressions were larger than my outstretched hand. The marks on the canyon walls, not slashes, not damage, something more deliberate, parallel scores at consistent intervals, went up to 3 meters and change. The scat I documented was from an animal eating things that had bones, large bones, the kind that implied prey of considerable size. I had taken photographs, submitted my reports, listed my findings under the appropriate environmental survey categories, and left quickly and quietly, which is a sentence that contains most of what there is to know about 11 seasons of successful fieldwork in contested terrain. Colonial affairs, treaty exclusion zone, had not been negotiated out of courtesy. It had been negotiated because someone at some point had been inside the interior and had understood what they were looking at and had come back out and written down what they understood in language precise enough to produce a formal treaty in 3 scripts. I had read that treaty 4 times over my career. The language in the exclusion zone provision was not the language of diplomacy or political compromise. It was the language of someone being very careful and very clear. The kind of clear that happens when the alternative is unambiguous. The Karathi Imperium's diplomatic attaché had smiled in a particular way and produced paperwork that superseded the treaty at the administrative level. Administrative level supersession is a thing that happens in conference rooms with good lighting and does not change anything in the field. I had noted this in my own pre-deployment file. I had not noted it anywhere the colonel could see it, because I had already understood by that point that the colonel's interpretations were fully formed and not accepting new material. The colonel had the paperwork. He had 17 soldiers. He had weapons rated for containment of any threat class. He had a navigation officer who caught my eye for 1 fraction of a second and then looked away. We entered the corridor on a Tuesday. The Ashveld corridor, for anyone who has not been there, is approximately 60 kilometers of canyon terrain cut by a series of ancient river channels into a plateau of ferrous red rock. The outer lanes are wide, well surveyed, with established transit paths and marker stations every 5 kilometers. The interior begins where the canyon walls close in, and the light starts coming from above in narrow vertical strips. And the ferrous content of the rock is dense enough that your instruments drift unless you've calibrated them for local interference. I had calibrated mine. The patrol's equipment was not calibrated for local interference, a fact I mentioned when we crossed the outer lane boundary marker, and the colonel's navigation officer began frowning at her display. The colonel said his equipment was military grade and did not require civilian calibration. Recalibrated my own instruments and made a note of the discrepancy in my field log. The first day was uneventful. The canyon terrain was what it always was, beautiful, in a way that requires patience. All dark red stone and narrow sky, and the particular quality of light that happens when you're deep enough in that the walls are reflecting it back, forth before it reaches you. The plateau up top was ordinary scrub and rock country that the colonists had been farming and surveying for 30 years without incident. And if you stood at the edge and looked down into the canyon, you'd see why the interior had been treated differently from the beginning. It wasn't the depth. It was the quality of the silence. From above, the canyon interior sounded like nothing, not wind, not ambient, nothing, which in a 30-kilometer plateau is not a natural acoustic condition. Something in there absorbed sound at a rate that its geometry alone didn't account for. The patrol moved in standard formation. In a canyon of that width meant a 2x2 column with point scouts and rear guard. And the noise they made was considerable. The military boots are designed for shock absorption on open terrain. They are not designed for canyon acoustics. Every footfall came back off the walls twice, and the combined sound of 17 soldiers in standard kit echoed and re-echoed until it occupied a volume of sound that bore no relationship to the actual number of people producing it. It sounded in the canyon like a great deal more than a patrol. In a territory with a resident predator population, that matters. Sound is information, and a large, consistent, unfamiliar sound in an enclosed space is a specific category of information. I noted this in my field log on day 1 and did not say it aloud to the colonel because I had already exhausted that particular channel of communication. I walked at the middle of the column, which was where the colonel had placed me, and I watched the canyon walls. I saw the first sign about 3 hours in, a territorial marker, fresh at approximately 2.5 meters on the right-hand wall. I stopped and looked at it for a moment. The parallel scores were clean and deep, and there was a faint dark residue at the edges that I recognized from my previous surveys, as the secondary pigment secreted from the forelimb glands of whatever made them. Fresh secretion means recent contact, within 48 hours by the viscosity. Recent contact meant we were not alone in an empty canyon. We were new arrivals in an occupied one, I told the colonel. He looked at the marks, consulted with the officer on his right, not Sereth, a different one, a broader soldier with the kind of posture that suggests weapons are the primary language, and said it was likely animal scratching behavior, possibly territorial but not threat indicative. Said that was one interpretation, I thought. Threat indicative is not the relevant frame. Territory indicative is the relevant frame. A threat implies an actor that perceives you as a threat. Territory implies an actor that perceives this space as theirs, and has been communicating that fact to everything that passes through it for, by the layering of the scores, a very long time. These are different statements. They lead to different conclusions. I did not say this to the colonel. We kept moving. I saw the second sign just before we made camp for the first night. This one was higher, nearly 3 meters, and there were 2 of them, one on each wall of the canyon, directly across from each other. That symmetry was not accidental. Animals don't scratch symmetrically across a passage, both walls, same height, same fresh pigment deposit, without intent. This was not scratching. This was marking, and the thing being marked was the passage itself. Whatever lived in this canyon was noting, in a language it had been developing for longer than any of us had been in this territory, that this was the point at which something entered its range. I photographed both markers, logged their GPS coordinates and dimensions in my field notes, and said nothing to the colonel. He had already made clear the nature of his interpretations, and I had already made clear mine. Repeating the exchange would have used time I preferred to spend eating and thinking. We ate. The soldiers talked among themselves in Korathi. I have functional Korathi from 4 seasons contracting with joint survey teams, not enough to follow fast conversation, but enough to catch tone and key words. The tone was confident, with the particular quality that confidence has when it has not yet been tested. The key word I heard most was a Korathi term that translates approximately as territory marking exercise, which was what the colonel had officially logged the incursion as. The soldiers seemed to find something out this funny in a way that involved a specific word for the local wildlife that I won't reproduce here, partly because the translation is approximate and partly because 6 of those 17 soldiers were, in the accounting that the incident report later established, the soldiers who encountered the Vareth pack first. I don't hold the humor against them. They didn't know what they were in. Most people don't, until they are. I set up my bedroll at the edge of the camp, away from the main light cluster, and ate my rations slowly in the dark. That was when I first saw the cub. It was at the edge of the light, which is to say I didn't really see it. I became aware of it. The way you become aware in a dark room that something has changed, without knowing precisely what. Then, my eyes adjusted to the shape of a darkness that was different from the surrounding darkness, and I understood that something was sitting very still, about 12 meters away, and looking at me. I have spent a lot of seasons in field environments. I have been watched by things before. There is a particular quality of being watched by something that is genuinely considering you, not as scenery, not incidentally, but with actual assessment. And it has a physical component. You feel it in the back of your neck and in the center of your sternum simultaneously. This was that. I did not move quickly. I reached into my ration pack, found a piece of the dried protein block I'd been eating, and set it on the ground in front of me. Then I moved my hand back slowly, put it in my lap, and looked slightly to the left of where the shape was. You don't make direct eye contact with something you don't know yet. That's not timidity, it's grammar. In most animal cognition systems, sustained eye contact is a challenge or a claim. I wasn't making either. I was just sitting there, in the same space, piece of food between us that I wasn't defending. I sat like that for about 4 minutes. Then the shape moved, very slowly, and what I can tell you is that it was low to the ground. And it moved with a quality of controlled silence that I had never encountered in any animal I had previously studied, which given 11 seasons covers a reasonable variety. It came forward about 3 meters, stopped, assessed me again, then came forward another 2. In the edge of the spilled light from the camp, I could see it clearly enough. It was roughly the size of a large domestic dog, maybe a bit bigger, with a dark slate hide that had a faint iridescent quality in the light. Not color exactly, more like the surface of dark water when light hits it at an angle. 6 limbs. The front 4 were ground travel limbs, thick and low, ending in splayed pads. The rear 2 were folded up against the torso in a way that suggested they were not currently needed. The head was broad and flat, with a jaw structure that told me a great deal about what it was designed to do. And the eyes were pale amber, very large, reflecting the light back with the particular efficiency of an animal that hunts in low light conditions. It looked at the protein block, looked at me. It looked at the protein block again. I stayed very still. It took another 2 steps forward, and it was in the light now, and I could see that it was young. The proportions were still slightly off scale in the way young animals often are. The head a little too large, the limbs a little too long, the coordination precise but not yet completely automatic. Old enough to be mobile and independent. Young enough that it hadn't been doing this for very long. It ate the protein block. Fast, practiced, efficient. It did not chew, it consumed. Then it sat down and looked at me. I looked slightly past it and kept breathing at the same rate I'd been breathing at, and did not reach for anything. After a while it lay down, not close, but in a direction that was definitely facing me. After a while after that, I heard it exhale in the way sleeping animals exhale. I did not sleep for some time, but I was careful not to move, and eventually the night passed, and, in the morning when the camp light brightened, it was gone. I didn't mention it to the colonel. It wasn't relevant to his operation, and more importantly, it was not something I wanted him to have an opinion about. The second day was harder terrain. The canyon narrowed in the midsection, which the survey teams had documented, but which is a different thing to walk through than to look at on a display. The walls came in to about 8 meters apart in places, which for a formation the colonel's size meant single file for stretches, and the acoustic situation became genuinely strange. Sounds coming back off, the walls at angles that made direction difficult to track. 2 of the soldiers said things to each other that I couldn't hear clearly. The body language was not the confident, territorial marking exercise tone of the previous evening. I saw territorial markers every kilometer or so through that section. I logged them. I said nothing. What was there to say? I had already said it. Made the mid-corridor staging point by early afternoon, which was the colonel's schedule, and he seemed satisfied with the progress. He had a conversation with his navigation officer that I was close enough to hear most of, and the substance of it was that they were approximately on track and would reach the interior coordinates the following day and place the survey marker and be back out in the corridor's outer lane within 4 days of entry. 4 days. 3 days and change was what I'd estimated when I'd looked at the terrain maps before departure. The colonel's timing was tight but not impossible. I found a good spot to set up my bedroll, away from the main cluster again, at the base of the right-hand canyon wall, where there was an overhang that would retain some warmth after dark. And I ate my rations, and I waited. The cub came earlier the second night. About an hour after the camp settled, before the full dark, it was just there, at the same 12-meter distance as before, sitting and looking at me. I had a piece of protein block ready. I put it on the ground. It came to 3 meters, ate it, looked at me, and then, and I want to be precise about this for the record, it walked around me in a slow half-circle, stayed at about 4 meters throughout, and then sat down about 2 meters to my left and slightly behind me, not in front of me, to my left and behind. That is a specific positional choice. I have thought about it a great deal in the days since, and I do not think I am wrong in my assessment. It was not positioning itself as a target of my attention. It was positioning itself relative to the camp. It was between me and the camp. That is not a neutral position, that is a considered one. I kept still, it kept still. At some point it lay down, and at some point after that I fell asleep, which I had not planned to do. I woke up just before dawn and it was gone. I lay there for a moment before I moved, taking stock of the inventory of being alive and unharmed, which is a thing you do after sleeping unexpectedly in close proximity to a predator. Everything was in order. I got up and started my morning and did not mention it to the colonel. Day 3, the interior. The treaty marker was a physical object. A stone post with the treaty language carved in 3 scripts including Korathi, set at the entrance to the canyon section, designated as the exclusion zone. It was approximately chest height on me, dark stone with the carve, deep enough that 11 years of canyon weathering hadn't touched the text. I had seen it on my second survey, and had stopped to read it then. The language was precise and unambiguous in all 3 scripts. The Korathi version used a particular grammatical construction that in formal imperial usage denotes an obligation that cannot be waived by administrative instrument, a permanent prohibition, not a guidable recommendation. Someone in the original treaty negotiation had known Korathi, formal grammar, well enough to insist on that construction. I had thought about that occasionally over the years. Today I thought about it as I read the post, and then looked at the colonel walking past it, pausing. He didn't look at it. His navigation officer glanced at it. She was the only one who did. I stopped at the post for a moment, read the text one more time, and then followed. The interior is different from the outer canyon in ways that are difficult to articulate precisely, so that you feel immediately. The ferrous content is higher, so the rock is darker, more saturated in color. The light comes from above in very narrow strips. The acoustics change, not louder but more complex. The echoes coming from more directions and at different intervals, so that you lose your intuitive sense of what is in front of you and what behind. The temperature drops several degrees. The air is drier and has a mineral quality that sits in the back of your throat. It is also absolutely, specifically, different from outside in a way I had noticed on my previous surveys and had not been able to categorize until day 3 of this one. The outside of the Ashfeld corridor is quiet, the interior is silent. Not the same thing. Outside, you notice sounds when they happen, the patrol's boots, the shift of equipment, the wind across the top of the canyon walls. Inside, you notice the absence of all of that, as if the space has a different relationship with sound entirely. The patrol's footfalls, which had been echoing all through the outer lanes, were still audible, but they seemed wrong in a way I couldn't immediately name. Like, they were making a sound in a room that already had a sound, and the two weren't mixing right. I understood, after about 20 minutes, what I was hearing, or rather, what I was not quite hearing. The silence of the interior wasn't empty. It was occupied. I had read about subsonic vocalization in large predator species, frequencies below the human threshold for conscious sound that, nonetheless, register in the body, particularly in the chest cavity, and in the structure of the inner ear. The literature described it as an uneasy feeling, a sense of presence without visible source, physical discomfort that observers sometimes misidentified as anxiety or environmental claustrophobia. I had read the literature in the context of several Earthside predator species and had filed it in the category of relevant background. Now, in the interior, 3 kilometers past the treaty post, I understood that I had been feeling it for at least 20 minutes without recognizing it for what it was. The particular quality in my sternum that I had attributed to the acoustics of the space, the slight constant pressure behind my ribs, the way my breathing wanted to be quieter than usual without my instructing it. That was not the canyon. That was something in the canyon, producing sound at a register below my conscious hearing, and my body had been responding to it correctly before my mind caught up. I saw the territorial markers every 300 meters, regular as posts, of the fact that the cub had not appeared that morning, and of the fact that my sternum had been telling me something for 20 minutes that I had been slow to understand. I said, "Colonel." He was 3 meters ahead of me in the column. There is a subsonic vocalization in this canyon, I said. It's been present for approximately 20 minutes. My body registered it before my instruments did. I recommend a halt. He looked at me. He looked at his navigation officer, who was checking her instruments. The navigation officer shook her head. The instruments were drifting again, uncalibrated for the local ferrous interference, and said something in rapid Korathi that I caught about 2/3 of. The gist was that she wasn't picking up anything on her equipment. Her voice was careful and even. Professional. I recognized the tone. It was the tone of someone who is reporting an accurate reading and is not responsible for what the accurate reading does or doesn't show. Civilian survey instruments are not calibrated for military-grade threat detection, the colonel said. No, I said. They're calibrated for the Ashveld interior. Your instruments are not. The subsonic vocalization is below their pickup threshold. My body is the instrument that's picking it up. He looked at me for another moment. Something moved behind the amber eyes, and I have thought about it since. Whether it was the beginning of understanding, or simply the consolidation of a decision he had already made. Either way, the result was the same. Continue, he said. The column continued. I looked up at the canyon walls. The territorial markers at this depth were different from the ones in the outer corridor. Denser. The scoring was deeper. There were places where the same section of wall had been scored repeatedly, over what I estimated were multiple years, the marks layering over each other in a way that suggested long-term consistent use. Not one animal, not one season, sustained population presence, returning to the same locations, remarking them, maintaining the record. This was not a patrol route. This was not even a defense perimeter in the military sense of the term. It was something more fundamental than that. This was where something had lived for a very long time, and had been marking that fact for a very long time, and the treaty had been drawn around it, because at some point a human surveyor had understood what they were looking at. I slowed my pace until I was at the back of the column. Not because I intended to run. There was nowhere to run to, and running is the worst possible behavioral signal you can send in the territory of a pursuit predator. I slowed, because I wanted distance between me and the weapons. I wanted to be as far from the front of that column as the column's configuration allowed, because what was coming was going to come at the weapons first, and I did not want to be adjacent to the weapons when it did. I also, and I am being fully honest here for the record, slowed down because I was looking for the cub. I had not seen it that morning. I did not know if that was significant. I did not know if the fact that it had been with me for 2 nights was a pattern that would continue, or an artifact of circumstances that I couldn't fully track. What I knew was that over 2 nights I had been still and quiet and had shared my food and had not made any claims on the space I occupied beyond the right to occupy it temporarily. Whatever assessment the cub had been making, that was the data it had been given. I looked at the canyon walls. At the back of the column, about 1.5 meters behind the last soldier, I was still. That was when I heard the patrol's point scout call out. They came to the canyon rim first. You didn't see them clearly. The dark slate hide was not quite camouflage, but it had the same practical effect against dark ferrous rock, and the way they moved, each one settling into stillness at the rim, meant that you registered them only when they stopped. I counted 9 adults on the rim by the time the first soldier saw them and called out. 9 on the rim. Canyon walls on both sides, approximately 8 meters apart. Patrolled in single file in the canyon floor below stretched over approximately 25 meters of trail. What happened next happened quickly, and I want to be accurate about that. because the debriefs I've read about events of this kind tend to describe them as chaotic when they were actually precise. What I witnessed was not chaos. It was the application of competence by something that understood its environment far better than the people in it. First thing that happened was that I sat down. Not a tactical decision, exactly, more the correct instinctive response to understanding very clearly where I was and what was about to occur. I sat down, put my back against the canyon wall, and I did not reach for anything. The cub appeared from somewhere. I didn't see it arrive. It was simply suddenly there, pressed against my right leg, very still, its head at approximately the height of my knee, looking outward at the canyon floor. The colonel ordered his soldiers to establish a defensive perimeter. I will not detail what followed. It is in the colonel's report and in the accounts of the surviving soldiers that I'm told are being compiled, to the extent that any of them are in condition to provide accounts. What I can say is that the Varith, which is what I named them in my field notes, it seemed as good a name as any, moved with a combination of speed and precision that I had never encountered in any animal or any military unit I previously observed, and that the canyon terrain was as familiar to them as the back of a hand, and as alien to the patrol as the interior of a hostile dream. The subsonic vocalization intensified at some point into something that crossed the threshold into audible range, a sound that I can only describe as the canyon itself deciding to have an opinion about the situation. I felt it in my teeth and in the center of my chest and in my hands. The cub pressed harder against my leg. I put my hand on its back very slowly, kept it there, and kept breathing. 4 minutes and 17 seconds by my field log timer, which I had the presence of mind to start at some point, though I couldn't tell you exactly when. 4 minutes and 17 seconds from the first soldier's alert call to silence. I sat there for a while after the silence. The cub did not move from my leg. The 9 adults on the canyon rim were visible when I looked up. Not gone, still there, each one a dark shape against the narrow strip of sky. None of them were looking at me. They were looking at the canyon floor. Then, over the course of about 10 minutes, they withdrew from the rim. Not all at once. 2 at a time, 3. Then, the last 2 together. The canyon was empty. I sat there for a while longer. The colonel was about 15 meters from me, behind a rock that had provided partial cover. He was alive. I had seen him go down behind it early in the sequence. He was still there when I finally stood up, and he was alive, and his weapons were gone. I did not see exactly when that had happened, and his rank insignia, the double-shouldered rank bars, were on the ground next to him, which I also did not have a direct account of, but which was clearly deliberate. He looked at me. I looked at him. The cub was still at my knee. I said, "We're going to walk out now, slowly. Stay behind me and don't reach for anything." He didn't say anything. He stood up, and I could see that his hands were shaking, and I noted it, and I walked. The walk out took the better part of 3 hours. I want to be honest about those 3 hours, because they were not comfortable, and they were not simple, and I am not going to perform a calm I wasn't entirely feeling. I was operating on the knowledge that I was still alive and that the cub was still with me, and that therefore I was in a category different from the patrol, and I was operating on the instinct, developed over 11 seasons of field work, that the correct response to being in a high-stakes environment is to be precisely as calm, deliberate as the situation requires, and not 1 degree calmer or more deliberate than that, because overcalculation is its own kind of mistake. The first thing I did after I stood up was check my field log. The timer read 4 minutes, 17 seconds from the Point Scouts call. I noted it, saved it, and filed it in the part of my mind that handles field data as field data and leaves interpretation for later. Later was for when I was somewhere with walls and a door and a meal and approximately 8 hours of sleep. Not now. I helped the colonel to his feet. He was immobile but unsteady, and his hands hadn't stopped their shaking. And his eyes had the particular quality of someone who has had an experience. That doesn't fit any of their existing categories. I recognized it. I had seen it in junior surveyors who encountered their first major wildlife event, not the fear which passes but the recalibration which takes longer. The colonel was a senior military officer of considerable rank and experience, and none of that experience had a category for what had just happened to him. which meant that whatever category it went into, it was going in from scratch, and that is a particular kind of disorienting that rank doesn't protect you from. I did not say any of this to him. I said, "We're going to walk out now. Slowly. Stay behind me and don't reach for anything." He didn't say anything. He stood up, and I could see that his hands were shaking, and I noted it, and I walked. I walked at a pace that was purposeful but not fast, kept my hands visible. I kept my breathing regular. The canyon at that depth, post-event, was as quiet as the interior had been before we entered it. That same occupied silence, the subsonic frequency present in my chest but lower now, changed, or simply different in character. Not the pre-event frequency. Something else. I did not know enough about Varith vocalization to read that distinction accurately, and I noted the limit of my knowledge in my field log as I walked. Territorial markers were still on the walls. Of course they were. They had been there for years. We walked past all of them. Every time I heard the colonel's footsteps change pace or pitch, twice he sped up, as he stumbled on a loose section of canyon floor. I kept my own pace the same. Not for his benefit specifically, though that was part of it. For the general principle that in an environment you don't fully understand, consistency is the safest behavioral signal you can broadcast. Whatever was in the canyon walls above and around us, I wanted my behavior to read the same way it had read for the previous 3 days. Present, von threatening, known quantity. The colonel's shaking hands and erratic footfalls were a different signal. I couldn't change that. I could only keep producing the signal I knew was safe. The cub walked beside me for about a kilometer. It kept pace precisely. Not the eager pace of an animal following something, but the settled, matched pace of an animal that has decided that this is where it is. I could feel its warmth against my left calf when the canyon floor narrowed. After a kilometer it fell behind about 2 meters, which I matched with a slight slowing of my own pace, and then it gradually increased the distance over the next few kilometers in a way that was too deliberate to be accidental and too gradual to be a departure. It was letting me out, I understood that. Not a territorial escort in the aggressive sense, no posturing, no herding behavior. But something more like the transition zone between one space and another, the boundary being negotiated in distance rather than in markers. By the time we reached the outer lane boundary marker, it was no longer visible. I stopped at the boundary marker and looked back. Nothing. The canyon interior was dark, and still in the way it had been before the patrol entered it. There was no movement on the walls or the rim. The occupied silence of the interior had been replaced, at the boundary, by the ordinary quiet of the outer corridor. I stood there for a moment. I don't know what I expected to feel. What I felt was tired, and aware of my own hunger, and aware that behind me the colonel had stopped as well, and was standing with his hands at his sides and his eyes forward, and the particular skills of a man who is holding himself knit together through the force of not moving. I said to the colonel, "Past the exclusion zone. The transport station is about 4 kilometers north." He didn't answer. His hands were still shaking. I noted that his breathing had normalized somewhat, which was good. Normalized breathing meant the body had concluded that the immediate threat window had passed. The rest of him would catch up eventually. That is a statement about physiology, not a judgment. We walked the 4 kilometers. The colonel did not speak. I did not fill the silence. There was nothing to say that wasn't either premature or obvious, and I have a preference for saying things that are neither. By the time we reached the transport station, my own hands had settled. I hadn't noticed them shaking, but I noticed them stop, which amounts to the same information. And the particular quality of alertness I'd been maintaining for the past 4 hours and change had eased into something more like ordinary tiredness. The transport station had a single Colonial Affairs duty officer who looked at us. At the colonel's missing insignia, at the state of his uniform, at the general condition of both of us. And then at me specifically, in a way that people look at you when they are trying to determine whether they should ask a question or wait for someone more senior to ask it. I said, "The patrol encountered a threat in the interior. I need a medical team for the colonel and a Colonial Affairs senior officer for an incident report. The colonel is physically uninjured but may need evaluation." The duty officer said, "Where are the rest of the—" "I need a medical team and a senior officer," I said. In that order. He made the calls. I sat down on a bench outside the station and ate the last of my rations. They were slightly stale. I ate them anyway. The debrief officer had been quiet through most of this. He had good recording discipline. He'd let me talk without interrupting, which I appreciated. You said 9 adults on the rim, he said. 9 that I could count from my position. There may have been more on sections of rim I couldn't see clearly. And the cub was with you throughout. It left before the boundary marker. Gradually, he made a note. Your assessment of the threat class of the Verith population? I looked at him. I don't have a threat class assessment, I said. The Verith population in the interior demonstrated aggressive towards civilian survey teams operating without weapons in off-lane areas. There is no documented history of military incursion into the interior prior to this patrol. I have a single data point for armed incursion, and the result is in the Colonel's incident report. The result being 17 military personnel, 17 military personnel and 1 civilian, 1 military survivor, 1 civilian survivor. The civilian had not presented a threat signal and had an established non-threatening relationship with a juvenile member of the population over approximately 3 days. He looked at me for a moment. You're saying the cub is what protected you. I'm saying the pack made a distinction, I said. I don't know what criteria they use. I know what I did. I was still, I was quiet, I didn't carry weapons, and I shared my food. I know what the patrol did. The outcomes were different. More notes. The treaty exclusion zone, he said. 11 years old, I said. Shh. Negotiated by someone who had been in the interior and understood what they were looking at. If the Colonel had the same information and read it the same way, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And the Verith population is still there, I said. Still in the interior. The interior is their habitat and their territory, and has been for substantially longer than the treaty has existed. That doesn't require an assessment. It's a description of the situation. He made one more note and turned off the recorder. Under the table, the small sound of a sleeping animal shifting weight. The debrief officer looked down. He was very still for a moment. Is that? Yes, I said. Should I? It's fine, I said. It followed me to the transport station. I've been calling it Vesper. It seems to suit it. The debrief officer looked at me, and then at the table, and then at me again. It followed you, he said, with the tone of a man who is revising several categories simultaneously. Yes, 11 seasons, and I've never had an animal follow me out of a field environment before. So I'm noting it as an outlier. Picked up my empty water cup and set it down. It also hasn't eaten anything that wasn't offered to it by me. So I'd appreciate it if someone could find out what the Karathi military uses for protein rations. 'Cause what it's been eating, and I'd like to transition it to something more appropriate before we get too far down that road. The debrief officer was still looking at the table. It's under the debrief table, he said. Yes. Of a colonial affairs secure facility. You have a very good perimeter security system, I said. And it's smaller than an adult, and it was very quiet. I paused. I may have helped with the last bit. He opened his mouth, closed it. I watched him work through whatever hierarchy of concerns was occurring to him. In that moment, is it safe? It hasn't harmed me, I said, or anyone in the transport station, or the 2 duty officers who were on shift when we arrived, or the medical personnel who processed the Colonel, the 3 people in the corridor outside this room. I looked at him steadily. I think the applicable word is selective. He sat with that for a long moment. Under the table, Vesper exhaled slowly and did not wake up. Your field report, the debrief officer said, getting back to his notes with the manner of a man re-establishing ground. You'll need to submit a full environmental survey of the interior, including the territorial marker documentation. I have 7 days of field logs, photographs, and instrument readings. I'll submit them this afternoon. And the animal will be submitted under a separate report classification. I'd recommend Juvenile Protected Species Wildlife Contact, which falls under the Environmental Survey Act Provision 12, and I'd recommend that someone senior to you makes the determination before anyone in this building attempts to change its location. He looked at me. I looked back. I say that. I said, because in my assessment, the Verith pack that currently resides in the Ashveld interior is capable of finding things that have been moved. I have some recent empirical support for that assessment. I'd rather not add another data point while Vesper is still young enough that the pack might consider retrieval. The debrief officer sat very still. I appreciated that. It meant he was a quick learner. I'll flag it for the division director, he said. That seems wise, I said. I stood up. Under the table, Vesper uncurled from wherever it had been and pressed against my left leg, solid and warm, its broad head approximately at my hip, now that I was upright. The debrief office looked at the point where Vesper's head was in contact with my leg, and then up at me. 11 seasons, he said, as if he was trying to fit something into a frame it wasn't quite designed for. 11 seasons, I confirmed. You learned to pay attention. I thanked him for his time, which was the correct thing to say, and I walked out of the debrief room and down the corridor toward the facility exit, and Vesper walked beside me with the quiet, unhurried certainty of an animal that knows exactly where it is and exactly what it belongs to. Outside, the sky above the station had gone the particular color it goes in the late afternoon in this part of the territory. Not quite red, not quite gold, the light doing the same thing to the air out here that it does, deep in the canyon, bouncing off everything before it reaches you. Stopped for a moment and looked at it. Vesper sat beside my left leg and looked at whatever Vesper looked at when it sat like that, which I suspected was more and different things than I was capable of seeing from my position in the food chain. I'd need to find it a better diet. I'd need to submit 7 days of field reports. I'd need to talk to Doss, who had already sent 3 messages to my comm that I had not read, but that I suspected had the particular tone of a woman who had been right about things in advance and was now being appropriately restrained about it. I'd need to think carefully about the territorial marker documentation and what it meant for the corridor access question, and for the 14 treaty review hearings that were probably going to happen in the next several months, and about what the correct answer was to the question of what the Karathi Imperium was going to do about the loss of a full militarily patrol in a zone they had formally entered over colonial affairs objection. I had some thoughts on that last question. The main one was that the Varith Pact did not have a diplomatic attaché and did not need one, and that the Ashveld Treaty Exclusion Zone was 11 years old and had a good reason for existing, and that the reason was still there, and was 9 adults large at the most conservative count, and was going to remain there regardless of what any treaty review hearing concluded about access rights. The second thought was that I had 7 days of field documentation, including territorial marker photographs at regular intervals from entry to deep interior, and that whoever reviewed that documentation was going to reach the same conclusion that the original treaty surveyor had reached, which was that there are parts of a world that belong to what lives there. The third thought was that Vesper needed to eat something, and that I had nothing left in my ration pack, and that the facility commissary was probably still open. I looked down. Vesper looked up at me with the pale amber eyes, the broad head tilted very slightly to the right, in a way I had noticed it do before when it was assessing something. Come on then, I said. We went inside.